In this video, we're going to explore the concept of Geneplore in creative process. That's what it's called. It's called the Geneplore Model of creative process. We've already talked about the standard definition of creativity quite a lot, extensively. The standard definition views creativity as an action, right? It views it as a process, the process of production. And it's production of what? It's production of ideas. And these ideas, in order to be called creative, have to be both original and useful. They have to be novel and appropriate. We've also talked about the 4Ps model, the 4Ps framework for approaching, viewing, considering creativity. The 4Ps framework, it broadens the scope from the rather narrow viewpoint and perspective on which the standard definition views creativity. The 4Ps framework views creativity from 4 angles, and it locates creativity in 4 different places. And all of those places, luckily for those of us who need to remember these things, they all start with the letter P. That's why it's called the 4Ps framework. So, the 4Ps framework views creativity and locates it in the person, in the individual, right, in our minds, as an ability to come up with original ideas, for example. It also locates creativity in the things that we create, in the creative products, right? It locates creativity in the process, in the act of actually doing creative things. And finally, it locates creativity in the spaces in which we engage in creative action, in the creative context, in the creative places, right? That's that 4th P is creative place. So the 4Ps framework talks about person, process, place, and process. Let's zoom in a little bit and talk about process. What is process? What is creative process? What are we talking about when we refer to this thing called creative process? Well, creative process refers to how we go about creating, how people do creativity. It's the how. Creative process is all about the how. We've talked about what, we've talked about where. Now we're talking about how. How do people do creativity? Creative process refers to how people engage in creativity, engage in doing creative things, and engage in creative acts. Right? So that's what process refers to. And I like to think of creativity as happening in one of 2 ways. I like to think that there are 2 general umbrella types of creative process. One of those types is about generating ideas. It's ideational, right? It's called ideational process. And the second type is about getting into and immersing ourselves in the creative experience, in the creative mode of engagement, in the mode of being in that type of process. So we have those 2 types of process. Let's dive a little bit deeper into each of those different types. The first type I just explained a little bit about. It's called ideational process. You could see the image here is all these light bulbs. That's the kind of public social image that has been attributed to ideas, right? A light bulb going on. That's what ideational process is all about. It's about the steps that we take. It's about the steps that a person takes in order to generate ideas, in order to come up with ideas, and more so, in order to develop our best ideas, in order to solve a problem, in order to create something that we think is going to be original, that we think is going to be satisfying for people to, engage with, all of that. So the desired outcome of ideational process, what is our main goal here, is to have an awesome idea, is to have a creative idea, to produce something, a product. And that product germinates, it starts out with the idea, right? That's why it's called ideational process. So there's a sequences of steps that we can take in order to do that, in order to come up and to develop our best ideas. The second type of process is experiential process. This also involves a sequence of steps, but here it's the steps that we can take in order to get into our optimal creative experience, to get into the zone, to get into our creative flow state. You can see the image that I have here on this PowerPoint slide is of a tap, right? And we want to be able to turn on the taps so that our creativity flows out, our ideas flow out. All of that can just kind of be up and running as opposed to kind of clogged up or stunted or halted or any of that sort of thing. So we have experiential process. The steps that we take in order to get into our optimal, enhanced creative experience, our creative flow, our creative state. So let's stick a pin into that type of creative process that we just kind of talked about there briefly, which is experiential process. Let's stick a pin in that. We'll come back to it later on in another video or a series of other videos. Let's talk now about ideational process a little further, and specifically about the Geneplore model as it relates to ideational process. So, a long lineage of people who observe creative people at work, who study creative process, have identified that creative people tend to develop their ideas in two separate and distinct phases, in two stages, in two kind of separate moments. One of those is a more generative phase, a more generative stage. And then the second is an explorative stage, right? So people tend to kind of generate first. They come up with ideas first. And then once they have like a number of ideas, then they'll explore those ideas. They'll work with them. They'll develop them. They'll explore them. And those generative moments and those explorative moments, they happen in distinct and separate phases for people who are, highly creative, prodigiously creative, successful in creativity. Let's talk about that generative phase. When we're in that generative moment, what happens there? Well, people tend to come up with ideas. That's why it's called generative, right? That happens by making mental associations. And you know what? A lot of these mental associations, they tend to happen unconsciously, right? It's very associative. That's something that we're going to explore in more detail a little bit later in the course. What else happens in this generative phase? Well, people tend to think in a distinctive way. We tend to think more intuitively. We don't tend to be very logical when this happens. We tend to be more intuitive. So that's the generative phase. What about the explorative phase? During exploration, during these explorative moments, what happens is we work with the ideas that we have, right? So we already generated a whole bunch of raw material. Now what we're doing is we're working with that material. We're exploring it. We're thinking about it. We're having discussions about it with other people, right? We develop those ideas a little bit further. And this type of explorative work tends to engage critical thinking and logical thought more, right? So we tend to think more analytically during these explorative moments. We're going to explore that type of thought in more detail a little further in the course as well. So you see we have these two different phases, these two different stages of process, right? Within our creative process, creatively successful people tend to have this generative phase and they tend to have this explorative phase. So in order to kind of synthesize that into a model, that has been called the Geneplore Model of creative process. In order to enhance our creativity, which is really the main goal of this course, the name of the course is Enhancing Creative Performance, right? Our ability to perform, our ability to accomplish tasks successfully. Remember, we're not really talking about performance necessarily in terms of getting up on a stage and performing. No, we're talking about doing tasks. We're talking about task performance. We're talking about engaging in doing something, some kind of a task that is creative. So in order to enhance our creativity, it's really important for us to develop our aptitudes, our capacities, and our skills. And there's different types of skills that are important for us to develop. One area of skill development that's really important relates to generating ideas. And another relates to exploring those ideas. And there's different skill sets that accompany each of those. So in order to enhance our creativity, it's important to develop generative skills. It's important for us to develop explorative skills. And it's also important for us to develop engagement skills that span across whether we're generating or whether we're exploring. They span across those different phases, right? Our abilities to concentrate, right? Our abilities to let go of our concentration, our ability to focus, right? So all of those are important things for us to develop. And as we move along in this course, those are some aims that we can have, right? We want to aim towards identifying what are those generative and explorative skills that are most important for us to build, both in terms of I just cracked my knuckles, by the way, both in terms of enhancing our general creative performance and enhancing our creative performance that is more discipline specific, related to what areas, disciplines, domains, and fields are most important and critical to our own career and personal success.